To join the United States in the fight against ISIS. That's part of why you're there. Others think that while that may be part of your goal, you're trying to save the Assad administration because they've been losing ground and the war has not been going well for them, and you're there to rescue them.
Правильно, так и есть.
Well, you're right. We support the legitimate government of Syria. And it's my deep belief that any actions to the contrary in order to destroy the legitimate government will create a situation which you can witness now in the other countries of the region or in other regions, for instance in Libya, where all the state institutions are disintegrated. We see a similar situation in Iraq. And there's no other solution to the Syrian crisis than strengthening the effective government structures and rendering them help in fighting terrorism, but at the same time urging them to engage in positive dialogue with the rational opposition and conduct reform.
As you know, some of the coalition partners want to see President Assad go first before they will support.
I'd like to recommend to them the following. They should send this message to the Syrian people. It's only the Syrian people who are entitled to decide who should govern their country and how.
President Assad, you support him. Do you support what he is doing in Syria and what is happening to those Syrian people, those many millions of refugees, and the hundreds of thousands of people that have been killed, many by his own force?
А как вы считаете, правильно ли поступают те,
Well, tell me, what do you think about those who support the opposition, and mainly the terrorist organizations, only in order to oust Assad without thinking about what will happen to the country after all the government institutions have been demolished? Today, you have repeatedly said that Assad is fighting against his own population. But look at those who are in control of 60% of the territory in Syria. It's controlled by either ISIS or by others, such as al-Nusra and other terrorist organizations. They're recognized as terrorist organizations by the United States, by other states, and by the United Nations.
Latest news, Syria. Al Jazeera headliner. U.S.-backed SDF forces carry out deadly operation in eastern Syria, dated December 13, 2021. Kurdish special forces backed by the U.S. military killed 5 suspected fighters in an airborne operation in eastern Syria's Deir Azor province, according to Kurdish forces. The Syrian Democratic Forces, a U.S.-backed alliance of Kurdish and Arab fighters, which control the semi-autonomous Kurdish region northwest Syria, said in a statement on Monday that the raid took place near the village of al-Busaria. While backing from the U.S.-led coalition, the raid targeted a hideout used by a dangerous cell of the terrorist organization ISIS, the SDF said in a statement. The ISIL group, which had captured vast swaths of Syria and Iraq in 2014, was ended as a territorial unit in 2019 with the help of an international military coalition. The SDF said gun battles ensued that led to the killing of 5 ISIL members, most of whom were wearing explosive belts. Today, SDF conducted an operation in Deir Azor Governorate, removing 4 Daesh fighters from the battlefield and performing a controlled destruction of explosives. This operation furthers the continued efforts to provide safety and security to the region, the U.S.-led coalition said on Twitter, ISIL using the acronym Daesh. The Syrian news agency, or SANA, earlier said American forces kidnapped a number of civilians in a large airborne operation near Deir Azor at dawn on Monday. The state agency said that U.S. troops have fired indiscriminately on houses, killing 3 civilians who were all members of one family. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, a war monitor based in the United Kingdom, which has a wide network of sources across Syria, said at least 4 people were killed. The dead were members of the same family, including 2 who were shot by helicopter fire as they tried to flee on a motorbike. Al-Busariya is a village that lies on the banks of the Euphrates between the two main cities of Deir ez-Zor and Mayadeen, in the middle of ISIL original heartland. ISIL has continued to carry out attacks, launching frequent hit-and-run raids from desert hideouts on either side of the border with Iraq. Associated Press headliner: Israeli official says Syria must not have chemical weapons. Dated December 14, 2021. Israel's intelligence minister said Tuesday that Syria cannot be allowed to obtain chemical weapons after a report emerged that Israel targeted the country's chemical weapons facilities. In an interview with Israeli Army radio, Elazar Stern would not directly comment on the report in the Washington Post that said that Israel struck Syria on 2 occasions, once this year and once last year, in a bid to block attempts to rebuild its chemical weapons stockpile. But Stern, a retired military general, hinted that Israel could not accept such weapons in the hands of the enemy to the north. We have a neighbor who has already proved that it doesn't hesitate to use chemical weapons even against its own people, he said. Bashar al-Assad must not have chemical weapons. Israeli officials have declined to comment on the Washington Post report. Military affairs commentators in Israel, who often are briefed by top defense officials, said the timing of the report was not a coincidence and comes as negotiations are meeting with Iran in Vienna to try to revive a 2015 nuclear deal. Iran has close ties with Syria and has sent troops to back the forces of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in the country's decade-long civil war. Israel has long opposed the 2015 nuclear deal between global powers and Iran, which granted Iran relief from economic sanctions in exchange for curbs on its nuclear program. Israel believes Iran is trying to develop a nuclear weapon, a charge Iran denies. One of the strikes cited by the Washington Post on June 8th was reported by the Syrian state media as an Israeli aerial attack near the Syrian capital Damascus and in the central province of Homs that prompted a response from Syrian national air defenses. There was no mention in official media of what was targeted in the strikes, although loud explosions were heard in Damascus. Unconfirmed reports published by pro-Assad media at the time identified the colonel as a leading chemist at the Scientific Studies and Research Center, General Aham Suleiman Ismail. The center is a government agency described by the Syrians as a facility for the advancement of scientific research in the country, but has long been described by Syria watchers as an outfit for the development of chemical, biological, and other weapons. Syria joined the Chemical Weapons Convention in September of 2013, pressed by Russia after a deadly chemical attack that the West blamed on Damascus. That's the latest news. And now my thoughts regarding the Syrian Democratic Forces. The forces are an alliance of different forces formed during the outset of the Syrian civil war in 2011, which are composed primarily of Arabs and Kurdish and Chechens and Armenians, which has a military wing called the People's Protection Units, or the YPG, which is a Kurdish military force, which has several ethnic militias, including the Syrians Operations Free Syrian Army. And they're fighting for a secular, democratic, and federalized Syria. Their main opponents, the Syrian Democratic Forces, are the various Islamist and Arab nationalist forces supported by Turkey involved in the civil war, and particularly the Al-Qaeda affiliates in the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, the ISIL group. But they've been primarily fighting against ISIL for parts of northern Syria. And the U.S.-led coalition, United States, Canada, Germany, France, Australia, they are supporting the Syrian Defense Forces. And it's not a surprise when I hear that civilians are killed. I mean, this is not news anymore. I mean, I'm reporting on this for quite a while now about the continued war crimes in the region, which are blamed at the feet of Assad, which is convenient because the people fighting against Assad are the Islamist militants who were at one time supported by the U.S. government, as well as Israel and Jordan and Saudi Arabia in the Gulf. And so we have this coalition fighting against the Islamist rebels, but at the same time, are bombing the Assad army, who are at the same time fighting against the Islamist armies. In fact, Israel is bombing Iranian outposts in Syria near the western border because Syria is a direct ally to Iran. And so is Lebanon. Who is Israel at war with? Well, Iran, Syria, and Lebanon. Would you look at that? The countries that are fighting against the ones who are really enacting the war on terror, fighting and killing these jihadists, are getting killed by the countries who say that they were the original countries who enacted the war on terror when they're supporting terrorists. I mean, I've done this many times where I've reported that during 2013, 2015, that Israel was treating members of Jabhat al-Nusra and al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria who are fighting against Assad, treating them at Golan Heights hospitals, admitting that they're treating these people because they consider Assad worse than the Syrian al-Qaeda affiliates. Need I mention the Saudi-U.S. partnership regarding the training and funding of these jihadists in Syria during a CIA operation called Timber Sycamore, which ran for 6 years. And so these people in Syria, the civilians, are getting killed because they're in ISIL territory. And it's not their fault. I mean, the U.S. wants to show you that, oh, you see the civilians join ISIL. These people who have no means to leave, whose only home is there, are, when these jihadists come into these towns like Deir and the capital of Damascus, Basra, Raqqa, and these people come in, you know, by the hundreds to these brand new American-made Jeeps, and they take over the towns, and they have no means of fighting back against this organized army. And you know, you have these people who kill all the men who don't adhere allegiance to the group, who don't adhere to their demented religious policies, which has nothing to do with the religion of Islam, and who are getting these weapons through Gulf proxy armies and Gulf backers through the United States and Qatar, Bahrain, to be used in massacres. And then you have on the other hand, the United States talking about chemical weapons used by Assad government. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Now, Israel is condemning Syria for telling them they shouldn't have chemical weapons. That they have in prior instances, like the 2013 Ghouta chemical massacre and the Douma chemical attacks, are blamed at the Assad government. And I mentioned in the report, and I'll mention here again, that the Soviet Union had talks with Assad and his leading cabinet about the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons in September of 2013. And they acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention. And with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW, in September of 2013, approved a detailed implementation plan that required Syria to assume responsibility for and follow a timeline for destruction of Syrian chemical weapons and their facilities, in which Assad signed. In October of 2013, the actual destruction began, actually on the day of October 6th, in which Syrian military personnel began destroying munitions, such as military warheads and aerial bombs, and disabling mobile and static mixing and filing units. And on October 31st, the deadline, Syria declared all its chemical weapons production, mixing, and filing equipment destroyed. And this comes at the heels of when the Ghouta chemical attacks happened in August of 2013, which was blamed on Assad. Not knowing that when these Al-Qaeda affiliates take over these areas, they take over the military installations, and they use the chemical weapons. There was no evidence that Duma was laid blame on Assad. And not only that, for Israel to basically condemn Syria for that, and this is basically, they don't care about the gassing of Syrian civilians. This is basically, they don't want Syria as an ally to Iran. But I'll show you the hypocrisy. Now, Israel has previously signed but didn't ratify the Chemical Weapons Convention. Syria did. Syria did. But more importantly, in 1983, a report by the CIA stated that Israel, after finding itself surrounded by frontline Arab states with chemical weapon capabilities, they became increasingly conscious of its vulnerability to a chemical attack. And it took a program of chemical warfare preparations in both offensive and protective areas. And in late night, and this is according to a report entitled Implementation of Soviet Use of Chemical and Toxic Weapons for U.S. Security Interests, right? This is a report by the CIA showing you that Israel was procuring chemical weapons. In late 1982, a probable chemical weapon nerve agent production facility and a storage facility were identified at the Dimona sensitive storage area in the Negev desert in Israel. And other chemical weapon agent production is believed to exist within a well-developed Israeli chemical industry. There's also speculation that a chemical weapons program might be located at the Israeli Institute for Biological Research. And during the El Al flight 1862, which was a Israeli airline plane that crashed into a neighborhood in Amsterdam in October of 1992, which was en route to Tel Aviv. In the cargo, it was said that the material that was found was 190 liters of dimethyl methylphosphonate, a chemical weapons #2 chemical used in the synthesis of sarin nerve gas, and that the shipment itself was from a U.S. chemical plant under a U.S. Department of Commercial license. On top of that, Israel is also suspected to have developed offensive biological warfare capabilities, and that's coming from the U.S. Congress Office of Technology Assessment. A report written in August of '93. And also, Israel is also not a signatory to the Biological Weapons Convention. So they're not a co-signee of the following: the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, the co-signers of the Rome Statutes at The Hague, where they prosecute you for war crimes, crimes against humanity, crimes against aggression, crimes of aggression. And you wonder why they can get away with things like this, because they're not held accountable for anybody. Nobody vets them. Nobody inspects their weapons cache. But meanwhile, they have the nerve to say that Syria should not have chemical weapons. But they don't mind being allied to the Gulf, who procures these Al-Qaeda affiliates like Syrian Islamic Jihad. Islamic State and the Levant. Al-Qaeda. And all the Syrian Al-Qaeda affiliates. Harar al-Sham, Jabhat al-Nusra, and all the others. They don't mind being allies to the Gulf, and that's because they're using them in the future conflict with Iran and their allies, which are the enemies to the Arabs. And that's Lebanon, Syria, Hezbollah, the Shia Muslims. And the Arabs don't care. But the Arabs aren't safe. They're next. And then all that will be left will be the United States and Israel. And they're the ones who are conducting these attacks, which are killing civilians, and they're now held accountable. So we, the people, need to hold our country accountable before it's too late.